Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Corey Telk. I'm the Director of Member Services for SSDA. Before I kick it off to our Executive Director, Tim Taylor, I just want to give you guys a couple of housekeeping items. First off, everybody on here is muted. All attendees are muted. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them into the question box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Also, we have uploaded a PDF version of today's PowerPoint up there in the handouts box, so feel free to download that as well. Other than that, I'm going to kick it off now to Tim Taylor, our Executive Director, and he'll introduce everybody.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to first of all thank Corey again for arranging all this. Corey, thanks so much, you're dynamite, and again we have about 60 people. We'll probably end up with about 80 on this very important topic, which starts to get your team and your mind rolling around negotiations as we head into a very difficult budget and really kind of an awkward time for us with the COVID. So you can't start working on your negotiations soon enough, and I can't think of a more talented team to help start that ball rolling for you than the panel today. And on behalf of SSDA, we want you to know today the LCAP executive order will go out to give you some breathing room to have some, that'll be waived up until December. So we're excited about that. It'll also waive your PE requirements and some other good things we're working on. But the next big thing coming up, and we're so lucky to have Brett McFadden on our board, because the next big wage coming up is going to be the May revise, and we'll have a kind of a snapshot of what we're looking at over the next couple months and start to look into next year. And at the federal level, we saw today Betsy DeVos finally rolled out the rest of the Title I money in a very flexible form for those of you that get Title I. So things are starting to come together, and the next 50 minutes will be very valuable for you to start thinking about your negotiations team. And I think in the end, as we look at the chat and all that, please get back to us at SSDA what other further help you may need. I've got a couple upcoming board trainings we're doing up in the North State. If you need some help, we've got a great board that's willing to work with you and help your negotiations. And with that said, Brett, thanks so much for being kicking this off, and we're very lucky to have someone with your skill set around the budgets. I just wish you had some magic pixie dust to bring some more money in over the next couple months. But Brett, please welcome Brett McFadden from our board and superintendent up in Nevada Union, excuse me.
That's quite all right. Thank you very much, Tim, and welcome everyone to this presentation. We're very excited to be this, and we're very honored to be a part of this. Just a bit of a housekeeping. So on the visual, we'll be pulling this up onto the screen here, and let me enlarge that a little bit here, and then go to full screen. And Corey, are you still here?
I am.
Okay, so as far as I'm a little bit of a rookie at this. So as far as the full screen and seeing the presentation, can you see it? You're okay?
Yeah, I would do slideshow, let's from the beginning, yeah, and then there you go.
Okay.
That's what you're looking for.
Okay, we'll go ahead here. So again, thank you very much, everyone, and honored to be here. Let me go ahead and introduce, or actually I'll give a slideshow or signposting of what we're going to cover today, and then I'll introduce our presenters and then turn it over to them. We have actually 3 areas to talk to you a little bit about today. We're going to talk a little bit about an overview of the storm clouds on the horizon and what we think the next 2 fiscal years may or may not look like. And with that as sort of our background, we'll give sort of 3 perspectives that we think superintendents and district leaders should be considering now, or should be considering over the next several months. So we're looking at the now, sort of preparing for what might happen shortly after June 30th. We'll go then and look at the next, what you should be communicating and to whom. And then finally, the third part is sort of the future, and sort of preparing your fiscal data and your overall game plan for developing your multi-year budget scenarios and developing your fiscal data and the quiver that you need to have for going into negotiations. And again, this presentation is looking at, okay, we're assuming that we're going to come back in some way, shape, or form. And we know that when we return for the school year, that we're not going to return to a normal set of circumstances by any measure whatsoever. But this webinar really focuses on what we should be doing between now and possibly going into the fall or mid-year of the next fiscal year overall. So let me introduce the presenters. And of course, myself, I'm the superintendent of the Nevada Joint Union High School District outside of Auburn, California, in the Nevada County area. And I've also had the honor to be on the member of the SSDA Executive Board. Joining me is a very good friend of mine and colleague and mentor, Dr. Louise Taylor, and she's the Assistant Executive Director of the School Employers Association of California. And Dr. Taylor served for many years as superintendent of Monrovia Unified School District and is retired for a few years, but still very active statewide and is recognized statewide for her training in interest-based bargaining, as well as her consultation work in the area of collective bargaining, leadership, and leadership development. Joining us, the third panelist is Mr. William Diedrich, who is a partner at Annelson Atkinson, Loyola Rude and Romo, which many of you know is one of the top-rated education law firms in the state of California. And Bill has over 17 years of education experience through his time and such, and is a recognized expert throughout the state, but does a tremendous amount of work in Southern California in the area of collective bargaining and sits at the table for a number of districts overall. So I hope I did justice to both of you and covered enough. So real quick, as we look at our storm clouds on the horizon and what funding may or may not be after the state of emergency or the shelter in place is lifted. As we've all been seeing, information's coming out that it does not look good on the horizon. I'll just share, an analogy. Many of you know I'm an ocean guy, even though I work inland, but spend my leisure time on weekends at the ocean. And one of my passions is to sail. So the little picture there, I had clouds like that on the horizon. I'd turn back and head back to harbor and put my feet up in a bar somewhere if I saw those clouds on the horizon. But we do not have the capability or ability to do that. And so what we are looking at is an assurance of the Proposition 98 guarantee, the basic minimum guarantee for education funding, will surely drop. And that districts should be prepared for reductions. Discussions that we're having at the state level indicate that we should expect a scenario for the next 2 years that is far worse than what we faced during the Great Recession, particularly in budget years 8, 9, and 9, 10. How much or how long this is going to be, that's not for certain right now, but we're hearing discussion of possible, anywhere between 10 to 25% net reductions in revenue for average districts over the 2 years. That's probably on the far end. And we're also hearing that fiscal implications associated with the pandemic and the resulting drop in our economic activity as a result of the pandemic will be felt 2021 and most likely into 21-22 as well. I had a board meeting last night, and what I shared with my board is basically said, at this point in time, our best case scenario for 2020-21, which is basically essentially a little under 2 months away. Best case scenario, flat funding for K-12 with no COLA. That's probably what we're facing at this point on the best case scenario. And frankly, if that's what we were able to get through 2021 with, I would consider that lucky, fortunate to be able to do that. On the opposite end, I told my board that they should be prepared for the possibility of 10, 15, 20% mid-year reductions happening next year. We'll go into greater detail later in the presentation as to sort of how to prepare for that from a financial standpoint and various multi-year projections and scenarios that you can run. But what I wanted to do now is turn it over to Mr. Diedrich and talk about, from a negotiation standpoint, what districts should be doing to sort of finish this year and then work your way into the 2021 year. So Bill, I'll turn this over to you. Mr. Bill, are you there?
Bill?
He's there, but he's muted.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, don't
Okay.
scare me like that, Bill. I thought I was going to have to do your slides for you.
Sorry about that. Okay, so really right now, what I'm seeing from my clients is they're working on two things right now. They're wrapping up the COVID-19 impacts and effects agreement, and they're doing their distance learning MOUs. So I want to talk a little bit about each. So talking about COVID-19 impacts and effects agreement, one thing that I've seen come up that districts are working through is what is essential work? How are we supposed to define essential work? Here's what I can advise you is that essential work is determined by management, okay? I don't believe it's negotiable. If you look at your management rights clause, there's a bunch of language in there that talks about all the things that you're able to do, and normally we say, that doesn't apply here, but now it does. You do set staffing patterns. You do determine, the hours of operations and things like that. So you are allowed to set the essential work. What we've been advising is just have the fewest amount of people that you can have to still get the basics done. It's interesting, Governor Newsom appeared at a CSEA meeting on Monday, I believe. He spoke to him for 15 minutes. And one of the things he said is that if you're hearing of anybody that's reporting to work on campus but not doing essential work, let me know, and I'll go there myself. Well, I don't expect the governor to come visit any of us, but it's a good point that we need to be careful and make sure that we're minimizing the folks that are required to come in. Also on the COVID-19 MOUs, one of the things we're dealing with are how do you deal with leaves? As you are aware, HR 6201 has provided us with some new leaves, and so those will apply. But also there are existing leaves. I've seen pushes from the union to go to a model that doesn't charge any leave. So if you are uniquely exposed to the COVID-19 virus, you don't have to come to work. Other districts are saying, no, we will make the leaves available. But they're going to have to use their own leaves if they run out of the COVID leaves. So that's been a big issue that we've been dealing with. And really that's kind of an administrative district decision what you want to do. Evaluations, what I've been advising districts is on the classified side, you might as well just bump them into next year. There's not some of the same strict rules on classified evaluations. But on certificated, I've been advising for your probationary employees to get their evaluations done if it's at all possible. And the reason why is because there hasn't been anything extending those deadlines that's come out from the governor's office or anything. So technically they still apply. If you have probationary employees, I would make sure you finish their evals. The last issue is PPE. And one of the things that's been coming up a lot is, there'll be a list of PPEs that the union is saying, hey, we need these included. And some of those things are impossible to actually get your hands on right now. So what I've been advising a number of my clients to do is say, yeah, we'll provide those to the extent that they're available. Now, that doesn't mean that if you can't get gloves or masks, you need to tell, your workers, hey, you still need to appear without gloves and masks. That's not what I'm saying. But at least, there's an escape hatch for districts if they can't provide the PPEs immediately. So that's kind of your COVID impacts and effects. The next thing is distance learning. And here's what I'm going to advise you guys. Right now, if you're working on a distance learning MOU, it should only be for the rest of this school year. Do not start going into next year because we just don't know what the instructional model is going to look like. So when you're doing these distance learning MOUs, they should expire on June 30th. Things that you need to decide. How are you going to train employees on how to use these online applications? Which one are you going to use? Some districts are using Zoom. Some are using, GoToMeeting. I've seen Google Hangouts. Cisco does a program. You have to decide that. The next thing you have to decide is what type of program are you going to put through? Is it going to be instructional with grades, or is it going to be just enrichment? Are you going to go to pass-fail? Some of those issues, like, for example, whether a district goes to pass-fail, are not decision negotiable with the union. But certainly you need to consult with them if you do that. There's a provision of the EERA that requires consultation. And so that would apply. Another thing that I've been seeing districts have been struggling with is, what do we do with our IAs? Can we find a use for them in distance learning? And if we can't, then what do we do with them? And so I've had some districts that have developed models that incorporate the IAs. Some are not, because we're only talking until the end of the school year. You know, I've had some districts say, you know what, it's not worth it in the short term. We'll figure it out in the long term. And the last issue that you're going to need to deal with, and it's really unsettled, unfortunately, is special education IEPs. What are you going to do? Let me just address the IEP issue. One thing to be very careful about is, during this time that we've been closed, many districts have fallen behind in IEP. So there's some deadlines coming up, some deadlines have passed. One of the proposals that I've seen a lot from the associations is, you know, a general education teacher will not be required to participate in more than one IEP a day or 2 a week. Well, be careful before you agree to that. It sounds reasonable on its face, but I have one district that told me they are 1,500 IEPs behind. And so if we limit all the teachers to just 1 a day or 2 a week, we'd never get them done. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about next year. And I want to talk a little bit about practical and fiscal considerations. And I give Brett the right to interrupt me at any time during the fiscal considerations and say, and if he thinks I'm misstating something, feel free to correct me. I know you're an expert on that. So starting with practical considerations, we don't know what's going to happen next year. Okay, we just don't know. I've heard numbers of rumors, including, you know, maybe classes will be on Saturdays next year. I haven't seen that in writing anywhere, but I've heard that rumor. But we're going to have a different model. I don't believe that we're going to be cramming between 24 and 30 kids in a classroom and leaving them in there 6 hours a day to instruct. I suspect we're going to have a very different model where students come in sporadically. So we need to be prepared for that. I don't think we should get ahead of the gun on this. We should wait until we have information from the state, but this is something to be very mindful of. And it's going to result in schedule and hour changes. It just is. Because, you know, if we're going to be if you're only going to be servicing like a third of your students on a given day, there may be some extensions to hours and things we need to discuss. Also, training will continue to be an option. Another thing to consider from a practical standpoint is, if teachers are still going to be doing work from home, do you need to consider a technology stipend? There is an education code provision that straight up says that you must reimburse employees for their use of personal equipment. And we've opined that can be done via a stipend. So is that something that you need to work on for next year? And of course, the last thing I wanted to talk about on practical considerations is, what is your staffing going to look like next year? You know, are you going to need all of your classified employees? Are you going to need all of your certificated employees? These are things to consider, and you may have to consider them pretty soon because, as I'll discuss in a moment, that the layoff window is coming up. So let's talk about fiscal considerations. I agree with everything Brett said. I mean, I think that we are very uncertain, and a zero COLA is probably a best case scenario. So one of the questions I've been asked is, should we consider contingency language? And contingency language still makes me nervous from back in the Great Recession, because you can't contemplate every single thing that could happen. And so one piece of contingency that I've been considering is taking a look at your projections and see exactly what you can do with a zero COLA. If you can give a little bit on a zero COLA, maybe you offer that and make it contingent upon the district getting a fully funded COLA in the 2021 school year. I think that's a possibility, if that makes sense. So in other words, see what you can do at zero, offer what you can do at zero, and then put in contingency language. The reason why I like that is it's easy. You either get a funded COLA or you don't. And so we're not going to argue about whether, contingency language has been triggered. The next thing, that I want to remind everybody to be thinking about is layoffs. I think it's very likely we're going to get less than a 2% increase, which means the summer layoff window will open up. Is that something you want to take advantage of? If not summer layoffs, do you want to plan for laying off folks at the end of the 2020-21 school year? So these are things that I think right now you need to be thinking about prior to June 30th and going forward. And the number one thing I will advise you is that do not commit yourself to anything without full information. That's all I got.
Hey, Bill, on the previous slide, we had a message come in in the chat box that said we missed the discussion about premium pay. That was one of the bullets on the last slide.
Yeah,
I was wondering if you cover that.
Let me talk about that. One of the big things that we've been seeing almost primarily exclusively on the classified side is a request for premium pay. Most of the MOUs that we saw proposed by the classified unions started at either double pay or time and a half. The statistics are always changing, but at least down here in Southern California, roughly 80% of the districts were not giving premium pay, while about 20% were. Of the districts that have opted to give premium pay, a number of my clients are actually considering only certain classifications that are coming into work. For example, food service workers are still on the front lines facing the public. And I've had some clients say, you know what, that is a classification that we should consider bumping the pay for because they're actually in a more dangerous position. Ultimately, though, this is going to be a decision that you have to make as a district. What goodwill can you buy by doing premium pay? With the understanding that, to my knowledge, the majority of districts still are not doing premium pay.
Okay, good. Bill, anything else?
I think that's it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. That sort of describes the now, and that would take us through June and then into the first couple months of the new fiscal year. What we want to talk about now is the next, and the next is really focused on who you should be communicating to and with, and perhaps also how you should be communicating. And we're primarily looking at stakeholders. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Taylor.
Thank you,
And I'll
Brett.
switch the
Slide.
There you go.
This is an overview, and what I would like to share with people is the fact that, of course, you have already been negotiating for this past year. Bill covered many of those issues, but what we would urge you to do is to make even firmer connections from this point forward and make those connections. Now, I'm going to put this in the realm of negotiations as an aside, but a very important aside. I would assume that at this point you are keeping in very close communication with the board. And I would also hope that you are keeping in close communication with your staff and your parents, because as leaders, you are the ones that they will turn to for the essence of the information. They are putting their trust in you. That's across school districts, across organizations, across businesses. But we're going to talk about connecting, informing and listening, and then looking at the full range of what could be happening. So let's move to the next slide, Brett. What I advise is that if you have not done this already, that you make weekly or twice weekly meetings with your association leaders, because if you can go through the information as it comes to you, then as you've talked about it together, you're not going to be hit with big surprises on anybody's part once you get closer to what's going to happen in 2021 or beyond. Your own district is going to determine who you will interact with. Is it your association presidents? Is it the chair of the negotiating committee? Is there a CTA or a CSEA rep or another organization rep that you would want to bring in? Each of those people are going to depend on who you're dealing with at your district. But I advise you this way. I'm currently at 4 different negotiating tables, and I have one district that just this week found that they had communicated carefully with their association president and their state rep, but then discovered after they had worked out an MOU for this year that the negotiating team as a whole had their nose out of joint. They felt really that they were set aside. So you've got to communicate with the group you're going to communicate with, and then you have to carefully communicate with anyone who may not be part of that group so they understand how the situation is going to work. But try to identify the people that you need to be talking to on a regular basis. I also noticed when I was in Monrovia, it would have been easy for me to have a joint association meeting with my CTA group and my CSEA group. Some of you, that may not be the case at all. So decide whether you work with them together or you may have separate weekly meetings. And what you want to share is everything you know and everything they know. It isn't something that you are all going to agree with. We're all facing the unknown now. We may get some information budget-wise. It may be a little bit more stable or not, but there are always going to be projections of what may or may not be happening. I suggest that if you go through it together, then you're going to be more likely to have a common understanding of how this evolves. Let's move to the next slide, Brett. Here are some suggestions. First, transparency. All the new information you have, put it on the table and give it to them. A lot of it is projective anyway. You don't know what's going to happen, but at least you have it on the table. Share concerns and questions and listen. Just what they're thinking about. For perspectives, you don't have to agree with the perspective they may have. There is some information coming out from some of the state organizations that the budget will be much rosier than we're seeing at this point. Listen, you don't have to agree with it. The same thing when they hear from you, it may not be going as well as we'd like. You can at least say, okay, I understand you have questions about that. This is what I'm hearing right now. It was interesting talking to Brett last week because he said, oh my gosh, I'm going crazy. I need people to work with me with this budget. We need to get things done. How can I have the patience to move forward? And the answer is, if you take them with you through all the information, then the patience on your part, because they haven't caught up as much, but allowing them to process it as you go along is going to be easier for you. So, Brett, did you have a comment to that?
No, actually, yes. Real quick, I don't want to infringe on your time, but you raise a great point. We have to remember that many of our colleagues, particularly in our employee unions or other stakeholders, they haven't been afforded the same time to digest and process information that we have. As leaders, we're often the first ones to get information from the state or the first one to hear about something. We have that element of time to process that. We have to afford that to our labor partners as well, so that they can do that. So you need to build in as part of your process and your communication a time for them to process particularly bad news.
Thank you, Brett. And that is so important. But if weekly you can share information and share questions and answers with each other, that's going to help. And then last but not least, look at the best, look at the worst. It's unlikely, very unlikely, but it could be that this summer or September, things will get back to normal. Very unlikely. What's the worst? And we've heard a number of projections. Maybe half of a class comes in the morning and is online in the afternoon, and in the afternoon, half of the class comes and they're online in the morning. Sometimes people have projected that you're going to have a third of your class come each day of the week, or just 3 days of class and then online work. if you think through those possibilities, it isn't that you should plan for any one of them in detail, because we don't know what's going to happen. But if you can start thinking through what could be, then they're going to have a better idea, and again, be with you in thinking through things rather than left well behind. Quickly go to the next slide, and then I want to get to you, Brett. On this slide, what I've tried to do is just put some of the phrases that may help you. I know a lot of people are saying, oh my gosh, if they tell us the budget's going to be rosy, I'm afraid that they'll think I agree with them. Just if you look through the phrases, here are our realities, let's go through them together. Here's what I've heard, what have you heard? Let's look at these ideas which apply to our district. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Even if I don't agree with it, I'm glad I have that information. Or if you don't share my perspective right now, at least you have an idea of the information that is in hand for me. And then even asking, what are people thinking out there? That can give you an idea of the questions and the answers that need to be provided to them. And you can help work together to bring them to whatever plan is needed as you go into next year. The main thing is at the bottom, we're facing a real challenge, but if we start now going through it together, then together you can come up with the best resolution for whatever you're going to be able to do for your students next year. And I think that that will help with negotiations. It will help with understanding, especially going into the budget. So we urge you to do that. And Brett, I know you need to go into the fiscal aspects of it.
So, all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you for doing that. Next, we'll get into the third element of the webinar, and that is the future. If we were more creative, we would have, used the Christmas Carol sort of theme, ghosts of past, ghosts of present, ghosts of future. But we weren't that creative in our presentation planning in that. So, okay, so let's talk about preparing for the future and developing your data plan. And I want to invite my two colleagues to join in with me as well. As I've mentioned to a lot of you, and I've seen the names of the folks that are on the participating in this webinar, and a lot of colleagues and friends of mine. And so as many of you know, I've been blessed with just wonderful mentors in my life. And I was at a younger age, I was very blessed to have Ken Hall, the founder of School Services, as a close friend and mentor of mine. And what he taught me is regardless of what you're going through, crisis or no crisis, you always prepare for the next round of negotiations like you're going to fact finding. And basically the bottom line is we all should be building our quiver right now. And we have the time and the ability to do that. And so I'm a firm advocate and have been for a number of years of building a basic toolbox that you have, which then you can update at the different junctures throughout the budget process, whether that be unaudited actuals, first interim, second interim, estimated actuals, and then of course your July budget adoption. And you should be doing that. And there's a set of characteristics. At the end of this presentation, we have 3 different checklists that we've provided for you that you can utilize as you're going through this planning process of the now, the next, and the future, that you can utilize these as checklists to make sure that you've covered these in one way or another. And so the checklists are great, more detailed. We probably won't go into those due to the timing of the webinar and such, but you can see that overall. So what I want to do right now is to sort of lay out, I'm going to suggest 4 things, and it isn't on your slide, but 4 things that I would recommend that superintendents and CBOs, particularly of small school districts, that you think about and you start doing now. And these are the things that I briefed my board on last night. I have to say, as a little side note, a little bird walk, I actually like the virtual board meetings. I do love the fact that you have the ability to mute somebody, or that you have the ability to wear shorts and nobody knows it when you're doing your presentations. with that. So it's kind of cool. So number one, I would say recommend that right now, I would start communicating, as Louise laid out, to your stakeholders, to your board, and to the extent that you can, your community, as to the storm clouds on the horizon. We don't know the details of what that may be, but we can actually share information and share perspectives of say, hey, we know that it's going to be really bad. It's going to be worse than what we faced during the Great Recessions. We can start that communication process now. Some examples include you can do little videos off of your cell phone, load those onto your web page. You can put out things in your local paper. Some examples, if you want to check our district's website, we've done that. I did a video last week directed to my students and parents. I've done columns in the local paper and such to sort of prepare for that. One thing I've told my board and my CBO is at least right now, we're not going crazy. And what I mean by that is we're not making cuts right now. We're not, I mean, we're thinking about what we're going to do, but we haven't implemented anything yet with that. So I think it's critically important to make sure that we're not going overboard, that we're trying to find that sweet spot and be appropriate and prepare, but not go overboard. I certainly think if you have long-term commitments, like a position that you're looking at and you haven't flown the position, or you haven't pushed that position out for recruitment, I think freezing it, yeah, that's an appropriate thing to do at this point, particularly if it's a commitment over a multi-year period of time. I think that's a safe thing to do. But I'm not cutting PD right now. I'm not cutting travel at this point. We don't have a lot going on in that realm anyway, because nobody can go anywhere. Second thing is budget development. Let's talk about that. Every year, your multi-year fiscal projections are a critical tool that you have. They're not perfect. However, it's the only fiscal barometer that we have at this point in time to do that. So as you begin to develop your budget, your multi-year fiscal projections are going to be a key element to your overall strategy of that. I recommend, and what I'm recommending to my board is for a budget development for 2021 is a flatline budget. We're going to be developing over the month of May, flatline budget with no COLA. That's what we're preparing for going into next year. We know it's probably going to be wrong, or there'll be significant changes, but as of right now, that's what we're going to see. We can all imagine that the May revise that we're expected to get is not going to be able to tell us the full picture, especially given the fact that tax receipts and such have been pushed back to July 15th. I'm sorry, Bill, did you need to say something? Anybody?
No, I'm good. I'm listening.
Okay, sorry. So we know that tax day in California and in the nation has been pulled back to July 15th. So the May revise is not going to give us a real good sense of where we are, like it perhaps has been in prior years. So we're going to go into the 2021 year even in the dark, more so than we ever have before. And so we're going to have to take some guess. One little side note I would say, as you're doing your budget development and you're working and you're communicating, this might be a good time. And I kind of did a little zinger in my board meeting last night where I mentioned the importance of reserves. About a year ago, we were getting criticized for having a 13-14% reserve and how that was not appropriate. Well, nobody's singing that tune now, of course. So one of my more colorful mentors used to say to me that, in this business, poop rolls downhill, but every once in a while, you can put on a glove and throw it back up. And so if you have a chance, mention that, hey, this is why we keep reserves. This is why we keep appropriate reserves and for times like this. It won't mean anything, it won't change anything, but it'll make you feel better, and it'll give you a little bit of a cathartic release. Let's go to the third element, and I'm going to call those scenarios. So number 3, scenarios. I recommend developing a range of scenarios. I don't think you need to do these now. I would do these because you're about a month away from doing your July budget anyway. So go off of July budget figures at this point. If you want to do them now, you can, but I don't think it's a good use of time and resources. So utilizing June or July 1 budget figures and assumptions, I recommend the development of 3 scenarios in your multi-years. And you can do more, but definitely 3. Number 1, do a flat revenues, no COLA, flat revenues, and plug that in and see what that looks like relative to the expenditures that you are at least right now committed to going into next year. Second scenario, 10% revenue reduction. Third scenario, perhaps a 15% revenue reduction. Now the actual percentages don't mean anything. You want to do 5%, 20%, 30%. That's up to you. But I sort of feel that a 10% and 20% give you kind of a realm and a range that you can see what you might be facing next year. And again, you're doing this all up of your 2021 fiscal year. The fourth and final thing that I recommend is the development that you need internally with your cabinet. If you have a cabinet, if you're in a smaller district and it's just you, it's you in the mirror. So that's your cabinet. I recommend actually starting to build your list of, okay, if we are in a dire situation and we are cutting to the bone and perhaps deeper, then what can we reduce? And I would actually begin to put as much on the table as you can at this point. One example, for me, we were very late to the game when it comes to professional learning communities. I have a large contract, $120,000, $150,000, to a group that's helping us bring about professional learning communities in all of my high school sites and into all of my major departments. And that's a major initiative of mine. Well, I'm going to most likely have to eliminate that contract going into next year. I've looked at my contract clauses and my out clauses that I can take advantage of. I don't plan to cut it yet, but I may have to do that and do that right away, either over the summer or sometime in the next year to be able to do that. So start building your list of what is possible and that you may be able to reduce and get away with, but at the same time, using those core values of trying to protect your classroom. I think a critical thing to remember is that although we're facing another round of challenging budget cuts, most likely the most challenging that we've ever had to face in such a small framework of time, but we still got to remember at the end of the day, our core mission is to educate our kids. So we're going to need teachers in classrooms. We're going to need curriculum. We're going to need some element of training, even if it's in a different type of setting, format, or new paradigms going into next year. But we have a job to do at the end of that with that. So that concludes my part of this. I'm going to quickly just go through some of the checklists, and then we can turn it over to any questions that our audience and participants might have overall. In fact, let me stop actually, and I'll stop before I go into the checklist, turn it over to my colleagues, Dr. Taylor and Bill. Anything that you'd like to add on this third part?
Actually, there's something that I was hoping to add to the second part. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So the thing that I want to encourage districts to do as part of these communications is take credit for the great things that you're doing to support your employees. If you don't, I promise you that somebody else will. And so if you are doing something above and beyond, make sure you publicize that. With regard to what you were saying, Brett, about looking at the scenarios, I think that's exactly the way to do it. And the only thing I would add is we should be very careful about overcomplicating things. There's a large unknown here, so very technical, contingency language is probably going to lead to litigation.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Louise, anything you have?
No, I think the main point is to start those communications early and help people go through the same information you're processing. And that includes what you may be hearing elsewhere, and definitely with the budgets as you've outlined. If you look now at 0, 5% reduction, 10, 15% reduction, then you're not looking at what is, but you can wrap your mind around what could be. And so it helps people, even though we don't want to have that bad news, it helps us understand it.
Good, thank you. So checklist number 1 is sort of the now. We're looking at this from the time frame of May and going into, you know, the July, perhaps even in the August time frame overall. And this is sort of what we recommend that you look at and make sure that you've covered during this time frame. Now, some of this will cross over, of course. Going into checklist number 2, we recommend this will be focused on May going into October, and looking at this, and this is really focused on your information and communication and what you're doing. I have, for instance, as an example, just we've set up a weekly meeting with my union, my certificated union president, and then my classified union president is one of our maintenance workers, and so he's here in the district office quite a bit, and so I'm making sure that I'm talking to him at least once a week and touching bases with him. And then checklist number 3 is on the financial end, and this is really, I put July through December, but you know, as long as when you finish your July 1 budget and getting it ready and pushing it forward for adoption to your board at the first part of June. And one thing I want to, you'll recall, and you'll see this coming out probably today, as Tim Taylor alluded to, is that now for this year, LCAP and your budget will be bifurcated now. They used to be, of course, you know, locked together. So those requirements will be, I believe, are going to be waived. Mr. Taylor might want to go into greater detail on that, but we'll be just doing a June, going through the budget process in June and getting the budget adopted by our board without the corresponding actions that are required when it comes to LCAPs with that. You can see a basic checklist with that. The one thing I did not provide you, and if you'd like it, you're welcome to email me. In our emails and our communication points are at the last slide in this presentation. But the cost of 1%, and I have a really good example of cost of 1% from my previous district of Monterey Peninsula Unified that really lays out what you should have and be able to update that overall. And again, I just end on the high priority is the continually update and watch your multi-year projections. They're not perfect, but it's the only thing that we have at this point in time. So in conclusion, I want to thank Dr. Taylor and Mr. Diedrich for your participation in this process. And I want to again thank SSDA. All three of us are very honored to do this and be a part of this. Our communication is listed here. And one other thing that I often mention is, as mentioned before, I myself been blessed with wonderful mentors. And so any way that I can repay that and pay that forward, happy to do that. So I know all three of us here are more than happy to answer any questions you have one-on-one if you'd like to reach us. I listed my cell phone there, so you know my email may change with each board election, but my cell phone remains the same. I'm kidding.
Okay, Brett, I know Corey's got some questions. So Corey, can you chime in? And then we may go 5 minutes over, people, because we started a little late. If you guys can hang on with us, it's worth it. Corey, can you show, what are the questions? I can't see them. I'm too old.
Sure. So one of the questions was, what suggestions do you have for limiting the scope of COVID-19 bargaining?
I don't mind taking that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, I know I'm picking up my phone to speak directly into it because I got a comment that you can't hear me. That's a really tricky one. One of the things that I've noticed at a couple tables is we started blending into other things. So here's the approach we've been taking, which is to say, look, this is emergency bargaining right now. This is not, we're not talking about, you know, the transfer policy unless it's related to the emergency. Once we get some degree of a new normal, we will set up regular bargaining. But for now, we really should just be meeting on an emergency basis. That's what we've been saying, and it's been pretty well accepted.
And Bill, let me add to that, that the meetings and sharing information, those are not negotiations. Those are preparations for the time when you go into negotiations, because you're all trying or helping each other just take in all the information. So those are preparations rather than negotiations themselves.
Sure.
I agree.
And I would add also, don't freak out. I mean, a few weeks ago, the mothership at CSEA put out a framework for an MOU, and I guess it included those that are working on the front lines were supposed to make double time, whatever it was on there. Yeah, of course they're going to put out that. That's what they do. But we control our negotiations, and we can tell them, no, we're not doing that. And so they do what they do, but it's our job to do what we need to do.
Corey?
Yep, another question was, I'd like to know what Louise would consider main points to discuss with CTA and CSEA.
Well, I believe that it's just the information that you have coming in for these conversations. So that if they're projecting that you won't be able to go to school in September or October, then you think through that scenario and you just process it together. It isn't a plan, it's just considering the concepts. So I think that you keep all the information you bring in. You can ask them, so what are you hearing from CSEA? What are you hearing from CTA? Let's go over that together. And then coming back to, and what are the realities of our district? So that you process those things together. If you're looking for a checklist of what you may need to review, I think that that was provided very well in the checklist that Bill, you gave at the beginning of the slideshow, because much of that will be carried into next year.
Great. And then the last question, it looks like we have one more, it looks like we have two more questions. Somebody was wondering if you could talk a little bit about basic aid districts and what they can expect moving forward.
Well, I have to say I have not, directly thought about them. I am a basic aid supplemental district, so I think basic aid district, I think what further complicates them, and I'm sort of like quasi in the club, will complement or challenges their analysis is what will be the effects on property taxes and assessments. Will we see that? Now, the good news is that's going to take a year or so to be fully realized overall. If this economic situation, we begin to see some uptick after a year, in areas like Marin, I would say Santa Clara County, Monterey Peninsula, and then perhaps other areas in Southern California, northern San Diego County, for instance, I don't know that they'll see a huge change in property tax and property assessments overall. Maybe a slight decrease or a flattening of property valuations, but I think the core fundamentals are still exist relative to property assessment when it comes to availability of housing and such. So I don't know that that's going to change significantly like we saw in the Great Recession. But again, if this turns into a long-term deep recession or possible depression, spanning a couple of years, well, then that of course changes. And then as far as what, does the state go after basic aid districts to make sure they're taking their fair share? Yeah, most likely. Though, if we are all taking cuts to losing COLA, if we're taking cuts to base funding for in our LCFF, I think then the state will look to basic aids to take some sort of similar proportionate reduction, just like they did in the Great Recession.
Yeah, and I think capital, we can, whoever asked that question, Corey, forward that to me. And Capital Advisors works very well around this area. And if we need to provide a separate webinar just on basic aid and basic aid support, well, we can do that. No problem. I think we probably should, because that gets very tricky. Corey, was there another question? I got a closing comment I want to say to the group too. Was there another question?
There is one more question. How would you handle a situation where the 2019-2020 negotiations have not been settled as of yet?
Oh, yeah.
Bill, you want to start on that one?
Yeah, so it's all their fault for not having them done. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of true. If you don't get settled in time, you know, there's risk associated with that.
Yeah.
And in this case, the risk is a calamity has happened. And so now, you know, districts aren't in the same position they were. What I've been advising districts is if you haven't completed negotiations, it means you've already, you know, taken a while to get through them. So what's a couple more months? Wait and see. The other advice that I would give is don't tell anyone that you're waiting for the May revise, because if I had $1 million to bet, I would bet that May revise will not be informative for you because it's before the tax deadline. So I think what I would say is I'm not in a position to talk about finances. Hold off here and do not try to connect it to the May revise.
Good point.
And I will just say that in some of my districts, at least one, they have not finished. Well, actually 2, 3, they haven't finished for this year. I think that they are now leaning toward trying to hold off until next year when the groups can actually get together. And in one case, they are actually hoping that they can extend the contract because it was to terminate on June 30. And so they're saying, can we have an extension of the contract so that we can continue working together? Some of them are trying negotiations by Zoom. I have a meeting in Zoom tomorrow. I could let you know what happens then. But it's just not as easy when you can't be working face to face.
Well, great. Hey, I want to thank everybody. And you know what? Most people stayed on the whole time and even beyond. So that means you guys are a great panel. I just have a couple parting thoughts. And again, I will be working with our SSDA board. When we had the campfire, one of the things that we did do was unite the 14 districts and the 19 charters and their law firms, because there's why have 33 different things going on? I anticipate, and I brought this up the other day with the governor's office, when we start talking about safety, and you notice that there was a statewide guideline, labor management, when we start getting some of these deep issues around safety and all that, I could see some statewide guidelines and working together so districts don't have to do it themselves. Part of that also is when we start talking about ventilation and cleaning your rooms and all that, that has a major cost, and we want to move that cost up to the state level, not have it be a local cost. And the disaster we saw at the federal level as we went into this coronavirus. So I see it's working together. I noticed, you'll see in my update today, Sac City Unified has united with large districts and labor on some issues, and they're sending letters to the governor. I think I'm going to work with our board starting Monday. What type of things do small district associations want the governor and state superintendent to be aware of? So we're not left out, because that was a very self-serving letter they sent to the governor to help the urban and large. So we'll be working on those things. And then I think the very last thing is Brett, and by the way, Dr. Taylor, every time I heard Dr. Taylor, I rose up, because when I was a bartender at Chico in the 80s, they used to call, I was a good mixologist. So they used to call me Dr. Taylor when I mixed drinks. Boy, that was a long time ago. But I think we need to get back and probably do an update within 3 to 4 weeks like this. When we have 60 members show up now, we'll be up over 100 a month from now. So we welcome that, and I'm sure we'll get feedback from our members. On that note, we're heading into happy hour, and I want to thank everybody, especially the panel, for all your hard work, and have a good night, and enjoy the NFL draft. We actually have some sports tonight.
Go Niners. Thank you all. Good luck to you.
Thank
Thank you all so much.